I'm Deirdre Scaggs, and I'll tell you just a little bit about myself first. I'm a native Kentuckian from Lewis County, which is in northeastern Kentucky, so the opposite from where we are down here. Tiny little town of 1,800 people, and I went away to college and sort of made a big circle and ended up in Lexington and planned to stay there for 2 years, and that was in 2004. So those 2 years turned into now 13 is what I'm going on. So I'm the Associate Dean of the Special Collections Research Center at the University of Kentucky Libraries, and we have family papers and photographs. We have an oral history collection. We have Senator Ford's papers in special collections, so we come down every now and then to meet with the Ford family, and we're close with Senator Ford before he passed away, so I always enjoy getting to come down to Owensboro and have barbecue, which I like to eat. So that's sort of what, I guess, prompted the idea to do this cookbook. I'm not a cook. I'm not an author. I'm not a historian. So all of the things that I'm not still led me to writing this cookbook. I have a degree in photography and then a degree in library and information science. So I'm pretty far away from both of those things with this book. But we have so many great collections in special, and one of the student assistants at the time was processing family papers, and he had some questions, and we had a lot of conversations about food, and so he found some handwritten recipes in this particular collection, and he just wanted to show them to me since we had talked about food. And I just started talking, and I said, wouldn't it be cool to cook one of these recipes? And you'd be taking something from the past and from the archives and bringing it to life in a way that you can't really do with any other kind of archival material, where you could actually taste something and smell something. And after I said it, I couldn't quite let it go, and I started looking for other recipes and started finding a bunch of other handwritten recipes. So before I knew it, I set up a meeting with the University Press, and they gave us the green light to develop it into an actual manuscript. So it was an interesting way to approach doing a cookbook. I felt really strongly about using handwritten recipes because I felt like either those were the recipes that these families made, or they were recipes that were important to them, important enough that they kept. They wrote them down and they kept them. They were maintained in their papers, and they made it into an archive. And so I looked at all of these recipes as unpublished manuscripts. So the date range of the recipes that I found is approximate, but it's approximately 1850 through 1950. And I was determined to find recipes from male cooks as well. The first recipe that we found was from a man, but it was hard to find others that were from men going forward. And my dad was the cook in my household, so I felt like I really needed to represent the male cooks out there. So it took 3 years to do the project. It was 2 years of cooking every single recipe, many of them more than once. There were, oh my gosh, probably 50 or more things that didn't make it into the cookbook because they were either too difficult or were terrible, just really terrible. I tell this story. I had found this recipe for a cake called White Mountain Cake, and it's the first recipe that we decided to test for the cookbook, and it was a complete disaster. A lot of these early handwritten recipes had questionable measurements, so you could get something that would say to use a wine glass of liquid or a coffee mug of liquid as opposed to a teacup of liquid. A gill, that was one of them. Butter the size of a walnut versus butter the size of a hen's egg. So they were all over the place. And then the instructions of actual mixing or cooking times were pretty non-existent in a lot of the early recipes. And so this was one that had measurements but no instructions on cooking. So I approached it. I was like, $3.50 seems reasonable. And the cake was overcooked and undercooked and had zero flavor. It was terrible. And so I tried it again. I did a little research because it had this kind of meringue-like topping that was not very good. So I made it a total of 3 times, and it was terrible in every attempt. And I was giving a talk one time. I think I was in Georgetown, Kentucky, and this woman interrupted me, and she said, "It's not you. White mountain cake is terrible." She said, "My family used to make it, and I hated it. It's a terrible cake." And I felt a lot better. So that just happened to be the first recipe that I tried for the cookbook. So the second recipe was the lemon custard pie, which made it into the cookbook and was really good. And it was just simple ingredients, lemon and sugar and cream and eggs, and you can't really go wrong with that. And it turned out beautifully, and it smelled great, and it tasted good. So I kept going from there. But one of the challenges in addition to just cooking the recipes and there being minimal instruction and having to do a lot of research into historic either trends or cooking techniques was trying to develop a well-rounded cookbook based on available or unavailable handwritten recipes. And I felt like one of the things that I felt really important, or that was really important in addition to the handwritten recipes, was that I stick to that as much as possible, because I felt like I was representing Kentuckians from our past, and that, as Kentuckians, we all have a connection to that, and it's part of our culture and heritage. But when you're trying to have more than just a dessert section, it can be really hard. And I also had, in working with the University Press, we've both agreed that it was also a Southern cookbook. And so I felt like if it were a Southern cookbook, that it also needed to have staples. There needed to be a mayonnaise recipe, there needed to be a pound cake recipe, there needed to be fried chicken, there needed to be biscuits, things that you would imagine should be represented in a Southern cookbook. And since it was a Kentucky cookbook, I felt like there had to be at least some things with bourbon in them as well. And so that made it even more challenging to find the recipes that I was looking for. You'll probably notice I looked and looked and looked for a burgoo recipe, and the burgoo recipe that's in here is the tamest burgoo I've ever seen. But it's the only handwritten recipe that I found, and it was the only one that was sized for a reasonable amount of people. Because I did find some others. I finally got desperate, and I thought, okay, I'll find another, I found clippings for burgoo recipes, but they would feed, hundreds of people, and I tried to do the math. I tried really hard to do the math. I used a lot of math. This cookbook is a great way to talk to 4th graders about math, because I really did have to use it quite a bit. Frances Jewel McVeigh, who's one of the women whose recipes I drew heavily from, she entertained quite a bit. And so her recipes were often for big parties of, 30 or more people. So the mushroom soup recipe, I think that I 8thed it, which was really challenging as far as math goes. And it still makes a gigantic pot of mushroom soup. But I make that still regularly for holidays because it's kind of rich, but it's really good. I'll tell you about a couple of disasters. So one of the disasters was the bourbon pudding. I put pie in parentheses, but in the handwritten recipe, it's called bourbon pudding. In this particular recipe, the handwriting was just all over the place. And technology was great for me in this instance because I would scan the recipes and darken them so that the writing would become darker, because it was also really faded. So it took a while to interpret the handwriting, figure it out, but it had very little instructions. And so I didn't realize I mean, I realized once I read it and interpreted it that it was baked in a pie shell, because it said mix everything and bake in a sweet crust. Okay, so I did that, and I kind of made a soup with crust inside the pie soup. It was not good, and that was one that required some research, that I needed to actually make it as a pudding first, and then pre-bake the crust so that it wouldn't all turn into a goo. And it acts a little bit like a caramel frosting. If the humidity is way off, it still is pretty finicky. So I still get nervous sometimes when I make it that it's not going to turn out. So sometimes it just turns out different. It just acts the way that it wants to act. But it finally turned out. I also made a vinegar pie.
We like vinegar pie. We do. Just pie, vinegar pie, buttermilk pie.
See, now, yes. I have seen many recipes where there's some vinegar, but this was a whole lot of vinegar. And so it curdled, as you would imagine, because it was about equal parts vinegar to cream. And I made it also 3 times, trying different ways to prevent the curdling action, because when it would come out from the oven, it kind of looked like what I would imagine brain matter might look like. And I imagined someone, in the future taking the cookbook and, going through and being like, oh, vinegar pie, that sounds interesting. And that's the first thing that they would make. And then, they would never make anything else again because it would look so terrible. I made myself taste it, and I'm pretty visual as a person, so I had to close my eyes and force myself to taste it. And it tasted really good. I mean, you would have just thought it was citrus had you not known that it was vinegar, but it looked far too frightening. And then my hickory nut incident was also, it wasn't a disaster, but it could have been. I had it wasn't hickory nut season, and there was a place at the time in Maysville that served hickory nut pie, and so the chef always came out and talked to everyone, and I was like, where do you get your hickory nuts from? He was like, oh, we order them online. I was like, all right. So I ordered them, and in my excitement, I didn't select the appropriate box from the drop down, so I got nuts in the shell, which of course is one of the reasons why they're not commercially viable, because they're so hard to get out of the shell. So they came, and I had spent at this point like $20 on these nuts with shipping and everything. And I was determined that I was going to try this hickory nut cake. It was a recipe from 1884, I think. I was really excited about it. And I tried a hammer. I tried lots of things. And I finally wrapped them in a kitchen towel, took them out to my concrete steps, and took my grandmother's cast iron skillet and proceeded to beat them repeatedly, which worked. However, there were pieces of shell all in the nut meat. So I spent an hour picking out pieces of shell. And of course I didn't get it all. I finally just got tired of it. And I went ahead and made the cake. And all the recipes are trial and error. And this one had 0 instructions on baking. And as it was baking, it occurred to me that it could be a failure. That I would have spent all this money and time on these hickory nuts only for the cake to turn out to be a disaster. And so I really anxiously, just peered into the oven the entire time it was baking. And other than the occasional or more than occasional shell as you were trying it, it tasted really good. So I felt like with the recommendation to only buy shelled hickory nuts that it would be a success.
Black walnuts, same thing.
It was awful. It was so awful. And I went back. Chandler is the chef at Chandler's restaurant in Maysville. And I went back and I brought him a cookbook. And I said, do you remember when I asked you about the hickory nuts? And we had this big conversation. He was like, yeah. So I told him the story. He walked back in the back and got a bag and brought them out and just taunted me with them. Perfect halves of hickory nuts, completely beautiful. And I was like, yeah, mine wasn't really like that. And so I said it took 2 years of cooking. It took another year of editing. And near the end of the cooking, at that point, it really started to feel like work. Cooking in the cookbook felt a lot like work. And so I would have this list of, all the recipes that I had left. And I had done the math, how many recipes do I have to cook a week to meet my deadline with the publisher? And so it got to be, like that every night I had to cook like 3 things to be able to make the deadline. And then on the weekends I would cook a little bit more. And so I might come up with things for dinner that a pie, some potatoes, maybe another pie or cake. They weren't things that would form a well-balanced diet for sure. And I'd be like, I don't want to cook anything else, so this is just going to have to do. So it started to feel a little bit like work then. And then the last recipe that I cooked was after I had submitted everything. And I really wanted as many handwritten recipes to accompany the written recipes, just so people could see where they came from and what they looked like. And I had included the orange pie, which is one of my favorite pies even now. I make it all the time. It was the last recipe that I made because the editor was going through the book for the final time. And she said, Deirdre, you've got this picture of the orange pie recipe, and it has meringue on top, but you don't have meringue in your instructions. And I was like, oh, you're right. Because I didn't think I liked meringue. So I think subconsciously I was just like, oh, no, who would want to put meringue on a pie? So I live really close to the Good Foods Co-op in Lexington, and it was about 20 minutes before they closed. So I dashed over there and got everything to make orange pie. And I came back and I made the pie. And since I didn't think I liked meringue, I'd never made meringue before. So I was a little nervous about that. And so I made it, and the meringue was beautiful. And I tried the pie and realized that I really like meringue. And I was able to fit it in without messing up the graphic design for most of the book. Since it's at the end, it was okay. So but that was the last recipe that I cooked, and I wouldn't make it for a long time. And then finally one of my friends wanted me to bring a dessert, and I was tired of chocolate and caramel, and I was like, I'm gonna make that orange pie again. And now she requests it every time, and I'm like, lady, there are other pies other than the orange pie, I promise you.